when we're trying to recreate the PS1, too good is no good. I may have underestimated the complexity of what I'm trying to do here.
Perfect lighting has always been the holy grail of real-time 3D graphics, something that's escaped us in one way or another for years. That's kind of why you may have been hearing a lot of hype the last few years around ray tracing. You know, the whole RTX on meme. It's the first time you've been able to have simulated light within striking distance of how actual light works, perform it enough to use it real-time in games. And now we have path tracing starting to pick up steam, which is even more accurate. Photoreal gaming is closer than ever to becoming a reality. But come on, do we really need photorealism? Is that gonna make games any more fun? Back in my day, we didn't even have real-time lights. We walked uphill both ways to trade in our old games to GameStop for pennies on the dollar to get the latest releases on a physical disc that ran at 480p, and we liked it. At the dawn of 3D graphics in video games, my childhood, we couldn't even simulate light at all, and yet some of the most iconic original PlayStation games had an amazing sense of atmosphere, including, at least it seemed like, some kind of interactive lighting, and few PlayStation games are more iconic than Silent Hill. Now, I just said we couldn't do real-time lighting in games at the time of Silent Hill, but if you've played it before, you know that not even 10 minutes into the game, our boy Harry here gets spooked, pulls out a lighter, and I don't know, man, that sure looks like a dynamic light source to me. So, how do they have lighting on hardware that couldn't simulate light? That's what I want to figure out. Don't you? Sounds like a mystery. Now, I'm no programmer, just a smooth-brained, low-poly 3D artist, but game development is more accessible now than ever before, so I think I can probably still hack something together if I beat my head against the wall long enough. I want to build a project in Unity that uses the same techniques for dynamic lighting as Silent Hill did back in the day, techniques that created an unmatched sense of dread that still resonates over 30 years later.
What are you doing?
It's nothing. I'm making a video. So, if we want to recreate Silent Hill's look, we first got to figure out how the game's lighting worked, considering the limitations of the PS1. While real-time, ray-trace lighting is a modern reality, it's really still only for the privileged few. The hardware you need to run it is very expensive, and even if you're able to get your hand on a modern GPU, the tech itself is very taxing, even on the best graphics cards. It's still not perfect, and nowhere near trivial enough to just flood our games with pixel-perfect light simulation, and this is with $1,000 graphics cards with anywhere from 12 to the better part of 50 gigabytes of video memory. The original PlayStation, on the other hand, had 1 measly megabyte of VRAM. At this point, your refrigerator has more graphical chops. There's no way we're getting this bad boy, or, his little brother, to do any real-time lighting at all, let alone ray tracing. Ray tracing wasn't even a thing back in 1994 when these guys came out. But Oliver, the PS1 technically supported grow shading. Yeah, okay, technically you're right, you got me, but it's not really what we're talking about right now, is it? Per object effects are a far cry from dynamic global illumination solutions, and their implementation on the PS1's limited hardware meant it was rarely used, and when it was incredibly sparsely. These effects were so limited that in terms of how we think about lighting in games today, it's not really what we're talking about. But good job for paying attention, gold star for you. That leaves us with the question: how do you simulate light if the hardware, essentially, doesn't have any lights? Well, we figured this out with 2D games and 2D art in general, right? You just paint the light directly in. Artists have been doing this for literal centuries, observing how light reacts with objects in the real world, then representing or interpreting that light with raw color values. This was the most straightforward way of adding lighting to PlayStation games. By painting some basic shadows and highlights onto textures, you get a bit of an approximation of light sources. It wasn't dynamic in any way. If you really stop to scrutinize things, you'll be able to tell that this isn't realistic at all, but come on. Look at these games. You were never going to confuse this with real life anyways. The PlayStation has an iconic and oftentimes quite beautiful aesthetic. I wouldn't make it if it wasn't, but it's an interpretation of life, not a direct simulation of it. Kind of all agreed to that going in. Silent Hill, and pretty much every PS1 game, painted some kind of lighting directly into their textures. Lighting is how our eyes are able to interpret form after all, so if a texture looks like something, it's because they're approximating light hitting its surface. The texture work in Silent Hill is really a masterclass on working within limitations. Every frame of this game is dripping with ambiance, guided almost entirely by the amazing work the texture artist brought to the table here. Solid texture work is great and works well, but issues arise when it comes to other limitations and techniques the PS1 utilized. The PlayStation, as we mentioned, had a very limited amount of video memory. Not only did this, among other hardware limitations, prevent games from having true lighting, it also meant the textures you load up to paint your fake lighting onto were also extremely limited. You could only have so many textures for your characters, props, and environments loaded into memory at once before you started running into bottlenecks. To mitigate this, developers again borrowed a technique that was already universal in 2D games. They'd use tile sets. A tile set, or texture atlas, is a series of repeating, tessellating images that, when strung together, create the illusion of a larger image while only using the memory required for that tile themselves once, no matter how often they're reused. For example, if you wanted to create a grassy field, instead of having to make a single massive texture that spanned the entire area and used a ton of memory, you could have a small square of grass that could be repeated over and over again that you could scale up as many times as you needed to while only using a fraction of the memory. In a 2D game, the entire game world would be governed by a grid that these tiles were aligned to. In 3D, there aren't any grids like this that are strictly enforced. Instead, on the PS1, the geometry of the model itself functioned as the grid. The majority of Silent Hill's environments are all made up of tiles. If we take a peek under the hood of the game's underlying geometry, we can clearly see that, and each polygon is mapped to an appropriate tile to create a continuous textured object. This solves the memory problem, and honestly also solves a labor problem. Having to texture every part of a level in the game individually would be a nightmare, but it creates another one for painted lighting. For example, if that entire field here is using the same handful of tiles to represent grass, how would we paint in a shadow on the grass if you wanted to drop in a tree in the middle? We could create a bunch of extra tiles that have a nice shadow painted in, but that kind of breaks the problem we just solved. However, there was another method. There are actually two different ways to shade a model on the original PlayStation. Textured shading, which we've talked about so far, gives the graphics on the console its signature pixelated look, but there is also a secondary option called Vertex painting. The difference between traditional textures and vertex painting is right in the name. You're able to paint color values directly onto the points, or vertices, that make up the model. The catch is, the raw detail of the mesh kind of determines the resolution of what you can color. Since the graphics on the PS1 are so simple, it meant the fidelity this method allowed was a lot lower than using a texture. Of course, these rendering styles aren't mutually exclusive. The real power comes from combining both of these techniques by layering vertex colors on top of the object's texture to create more complicated visuals. There are a cornucopia of uses for vertex coloring, and I'm sure we'll be talking about a bunch of them in the future, so subscribe if you're curious. But the use case we're interested in right now when talking about Silent Hill is simulating unique shadow placement for its repeating tile sets. Just like the tree example earlier, painted shadows in this case would be pretty much impossible, since the environments are using the same tiles over and over in tons of different locations, which will need totally different shadow placements depending on where they are. So instead, the game uses vertex colors to overlay custom shadows on top of the tiles, so we get the best of both systems working together. So, this is all very educational, but doesn't really answer the question posed at the top. These are all static lights. What about a dynamic light setup, where lights move around with the player? Well, it's basically the same technique. Instead of placing the vertex colors subtly around the level, the environment just has an entire layer of solid black for its vertex colors. Then, with the help of some programming, the game can dynamically hide portions of that black layer as the player moves around, effectively faking a dynamic light source. The lighting looks a little bit jittery because it's using that same grid of vertices on the model to control its effect. That's basically the resolution of the light. So as the effect moves away from one of those points, the game tries its best to interpolate between the transition, and that harsh blending effect is just an artifact of that. So, if I want to create this effect today in Unity, how would we go about it? First, we're going to need a character. I think I'm going to use my character Sarah for this one. quickly throw together a simple flashlight and slap it in her hand, grab some animations from Mixamo, then tweak them in Blender to account for her holding the flashlight, as well as having big floppy ears and a tail. And we have everything ready to get her controller set up in Unity. Silent Hill used tank controls for its characters, but since we already did that in the last video talking about Resident Evil, I'm just going to use a standard movement system here. Since we have a real-time environment and a moving camera, it'll be a bit more intuitive to update this element of the controls. After all, we're trying to make something that looks like Silent Hill, not strictly play like it. I'll create a simple camera system using Cinemachine in Unity that lets you quickly get a dynamic camera setup going, and I'll have it follow Sarah's movements with a touch of delay and easing to make it feel a bit more polished. And there we go! Character is all set up. Next, we're gonna need an environment. Maybe instead of being trapped in a cursed town being overtaken by darkness, Sarah is just caught in a small convenience store when the power goes out. Why torture her needlessly, right? I happen to have made a convenience store model last year for an animation project that I'm definitely 100% totally gonna finish. Eventually. But for now, it's a good enough environment as I need to just set our scene for this recreation. Just like in Silent Hill, most of the environment here was using a simple tile set. The floors, the walls, and the counters are all pulling from this simple repeating texture atlas. For props like the ice cream cooler and shelving, those are using dedicated textures outside the atlas. Now, for the meat of the project, getting the actual Vertex lighting effect. To do that, we're going to have to create a shader, which is a way of handling how the game engine will display materials. It's a lot more than that. It's actually insanely powerful. It can do a ton of stuff. Pretty much every visual effect you see in a video game is some kind of shader. So we're gonna make one ourselves. Now, traditionally, you'd create shaders using a scripting language called HLSL, but I'm a dummy and don't know how to program like that. Luckily, Unity realized that dummies like me can spend money too, so they added a second way of creating shaders using a visual, node-based system, which is a lot more my speed. The shader honestly doesn't have to do all that much. It just needs to be able to overlay the vertex colors on top of the textures, then have an area of those vertex colors disabled by the location of an object. In this case, Sarah's flashlight. How hard can that be?
I may have underestimated the complexity of what I'm trying to do here. 1995 tech. Not as simple as you might expect. I've actually half succeeded twice, but neither option is acceptable and works exactly how I'd want it to, so I'm kind of stuck right now. The first thing that I did was a pretty conventional way of doing the shader. Address the vertex colors and the texture and combine them in shader graph. Pretty simple, got them to show up, that's great. Hiding the vertex colors isn't the problem. I actually was able to do that. I was able to get it to function, and it works. The problem is that it's not hiding them per vertex like the PS1 would, it's hiding them per pixel. So you're getting like a perfectly clean circle around the area of effect, which is objectively a better solution. It's just not something that the PS1 could do. But outside of this bizarre experiment I'm doing here, there's really no reason why you'd want to do that. So there's no way to address the vertex colors per vertex built into shader graph, at least from what I could tell. And so I asked my friend about it, who is a professional programmer, and he said that there was no way to do it. In shader graph, you'd have to write custom code in HLSL, which is what I was trying to avoid. So the second thing that I tried that also worked, and arguably worked better and easier, was that I found randomly on a forum, just trying to figure this out, Unity has like built-in light objects. And by default, they work like traditional game lights do, which is not what we're trying to do here. So that was like immediately thrown out right off the rip. But if you use the baseline original Unity render pipeline and you set a light to be not important, it lights per vertex instead of per pixel in one click. And I was like, oh, that's it. That's the solution. It's even simpler than I thought it was. I've been beating my head against this for no reason. And so I set up a test scene. I set the lights to kind of be like a trail of lights to kind of mimic the shape of a cone. And then I turned them to not important and I set them up in a test scene and it worked. It worked great. I'm like, we're done. We did it. And so then I moved it out of the test scene and into the environment that I talked about, and that's where the problem started. See, my test scene had just been a flat plane that Sarah could walk on. And so when you're just kind of in a void, the effect works exactly as you would expect. The problem that I didn't realize until I put it into a small enclosed space is that even though it's lighting per vertex, these lights are still using global illumination. So it's not just affecting the immediate area like the PS1 would, it's simulating some secondary bounce lighting. So as soon as you put it into a small space, nothing outside of that area is perfectly black anymore. You're getting some secondary lights from the fake virtual lights kind of bouncing off the area, and it was inaccurate. It was too accurate. That was the problem. It was too good. And when we're trying to recreate the PS1, too good is no good. So that's where I'm at right now, is that I'm either going to have to A, learn HLSL, but this video is already a week delayed that I wanted it to, as I was beating my head against this problem, especially after I thought I had a solution, was carrying onward with it. I don't want it to continue to be delayed even further, so I might have to find a workaround. And if I can find that workaround, then we're good. Solution time. So it turns out that trying to dynamically address vertex colors is above my pay grade. However, part of what makes game dev so much more approachable today compared to the dark age of the mid-90s is that we have the internet, where solutions to all your problems are just a click away. For the low price of $3.99, my favorite. With this asset in place, all we gotta do is attach a script to our camera and assign the correct materials to our objects, and look at that, it even lets you easily set up pixelation and dithering. It's subtle, but getting the proper vertex color lighting is really the key to making this feel authentic. Being able to turn off global illumination and keep this lighting confined to just this small area of visibility is what ties this whole project together. It really is the difference between this looking like Silent Hill and just a janky Unity project. Now, I know this is just a stupid little demo scene and not even a full game, but I'm still really proud of it. We're spoiled nowadays when it comes to technology. Seeing how all this stuff was done in the late 90s, how technically complex it was, and how financially prohibitive so much of the essential tools were, I'm 100% certain that I'd never have gotten into this medium if I had to go through that kind of pain. Look, I know my limits, okay? Being able to create game projects as someone who's primarily just an artist with no real programming knowledge and just a few days to turn around and make something that little kid me would have been salivating over in the pages of EGM magazine or GamePro, it honestly feels like magic. The democratization of technology and the generosity of the community surrounding that tech, creating shaders, tutorials, and assets for people to use and make cool things, it's the cycle of creativity. Art begets more art. Inspiration to creation to inspiring the next person. On and on into infinity. That's a huge part of why I make videos and animations and stuff, to do my part to keep that cycle going. And that's really the thing for me at the end of the day, putting stuff on the screen that would have sparked the imagination of my younger self, and have him tripping over himself to get into GameStop and foolishly trade in half his collection to get his hands on. Going uphill both ways, of course, as one did. Now, you may be wondering, Oliver, how could you make an entire video about Silent Hill and not talk about the game's fog? And yeah, I know, it's like the most defining aspect of the game. But now that I'm mentioning it here, if you've already left a comment asking about it, I know you didn't watch the whole video. The fog in Silent Hill is a really interesting element of the game. It was a fantastic way of taking a technical limitation, the limited draw distance of the PlayStation, and embracing it as a visual element of the environment that set the tone for the game, instead of a non-diegetic part of the presentation that needed to be ignored. It's great stuff. The reason it's not in this video is that A, pretty much everybody already knows that, and B, I also have another video I want to do that talks about the PS1's draw distance in the near future, so I'm saving talking about it in more depth for that. It'll be a good one, I promise. So subscribe if you haven't already. If you're curious, I have a link to the description to itch.io where you can play the demo scene made for this video to see how it all came together. If you like this video, giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel would be amazing. If you loved it, I have an extended cut over on my Patreon. We talk about some more nuances about the camera system in Silent Hill compared to Resident Evil, along with some other miscellaneous observations. I also have over 100 bonus podcasts where you get to decide the topics each week. If you'd rather not support me indefinitely, I have a Ko-fi link if you want to spot me a Red Bull while I edit the next video, which I'm probably doing as you're watching this. If you're an OG Silent Hill fan, you probably also like the PS1 Resident Evil trilogy. Check out this video next where we break down how the fixed camera angles worked in that game and recreate that in Unity as well. I'm just Oliver, and this is Pop Strikers. Have a good one.